Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. Today I'm here to talk about my discernment story with the Dominicans of the Central Province. So the Dominicans, the order of preachers, they are a religious order in the Catholic Church, and they're kind of known as the brain cells of the church. So think about people like St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Albert the Great, Father Gregory Pine, Father Thomas Joseph White. And the name Dominican is derived not from the Dominican Republic, but from the founder of the order, St. Dominic. Just as, for instance, the Franciscans derive their name from their founder, St. Francis. Now, the Central Province is one of four provinces in the United States of Dominicans. So you have the Western Province, the Eastern Province, the Southern Province, and the Central Province. Now, a lot of people have been asking me, Swan, why did you choose the Central Province when the West and the East have more established reputations? And the answer is, I feel a sense of loyalty to this region. And I'd like to do my part in kind of maybe, expanding the Central Province and putting it more on the map as much as the East and the West. I want to be of service to this community that has raised me ever since my family moved to the United States. So with that being said, some of you might be wondering, Swan, are you a priest now? And the answer is no. Hopefully in the future that will happen, but I'm not sure just yet because I don't know the future. I don't have infallible certainty of what will be to come. But what I can tell you is that I am going to be a novice brother. And so what that means is I'm not officially OP. And by OP, I mean I don't have the official Dominican title just yet. If you think about, for instance, like Father Thomas Joseph White, when you see his name written out, you see then a comma and OP. Or take like Gavin Kerr, a lay Dominican. I've interviewed him on my channel multiple times. Gavin, after his name, when he publishes a book like with Oxford University Press, it says Gavin Kerr, comma, OP, right? Because he is an officially recognized lay member of the Dominican order. So in a similar way then, I am going to be living out the Dominican way of life, but I'm not going to be officially recognized just yet as like this public representative, like 100% this guy is a Dominican with us. But I'm going to be wearing the habit. I will be, practicing preaching. I will be living out the religious life and doing their prayers, attending, their masses with them and living out community with them. So to give you the kind of timeline for what this all looks like. So there's a pre-novitiate that's going to begin on July 19th in St. Louis, and that will last until August 3rd. And then from St. Louis, I'll fly out with my brothers and with my novice master, the kind of like the priest who's kind of watching over us in the Dominican order to make sure that we're discerning well. We'll be moving to Denver, Colorado, and that will happen on August 3rd. So from August 3rd, then, the novitiate begins, this year of discernment with the Dominicans. Now, should that first year go well, what will then happen is I'll make simple vows. So simple vows are 3-year-long vows that are in accordance with the religious life. And so, the religious in the Catholic Church, by religious, we're talking about specifically the people who live out life in a religious order. So we're not saying if you're not in a religious order, you're not religious. That's not what that means. Anyway, so I would make a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but technically I'd only make one vow, which is obedience, which entails, poverty and chastity. Obviously, chastity, aside from just minimal sexual purity that is expected of any person, is going to also specifically call upon me to be, celibate or just abstaining from sexual relations as part of being chaste within a religious order. Now, poverty doesn't mean that I'm going to be living destitute. It doesn't mean I'm going to be eating crumbs off the floor and that's my lunch and dinner. What it means is that, in a religious community, in a religious order, you share all things in common and you don't have a private bank account. You're not pursuing things for private gain, and whatever, accolades and achievements you have, you kind of share them with your brothers. You don't kind of get a $500 check and deposit it for yourself. It's like, nope, that money goes to all the brothers. You all share it together. So it's not like you can't touch a dollar bill or something like that. And then the vow of obedience is this idea of respecting the demands of the order and also respecting your superiors and not living in such a way where you're kind of a lone ranger, right? It's not just about you now. It's about your brothers. It's about this whole community. It's about making sure that you live in a way that is conducive to harmony and not to schism and differences. Now, with that being said, I guess I can talk about my journey of discerning with the Dominicans. So, the first question you have to answer, and it's the first question that any vocations director or any council will ask you, is why this order? Like, for instance, if I'm discerning with the Dominicans, they might ask, why not the Franciscans? Why not the Jesuits? Why not the Augustinians, right? Why not any of these other groups? And the reason why I think I'm called to the Dominicans is because, well, that's a big story. So I guess I'll begin with St. Thomas Aquinas. So when I was in the process of converting from being Baptist to being Catholic, I remember there was this day that it hit me that I need to become Catholic, that it was no longer just an intellectual game. It was no longer just, clarifying misconceptions that I had, but it was actually positively now, I need to become Catholic. The church is my home. And I remember I reached out to St. Thomas Aquinas because I was terrified of what the future was going to hold. Because, what's going to happen when my friends and family find out? What's going to happen, seeing the anti-Catholic prejudice that is here in the world? How am I going to handle that? And so I reached out to St. Thomas, and I remember I heard this voice that replied, and it said, "Swan, you've been a good son to your mother and father, but now I want you as my own." And I knew that that was not the voice of St. Thomas Aquinas. It was a voice that I'd heard since my childhood. It was the voice of God. And I know what some people might be saying, even fellow Christians, right? They might be saying, "Swan, what are you talking about? That's crazy, man. Like hearing voices in your head, and thinking that you can communicate with God or that you can reach out to a saint in heaven and paradise." And the answer is, yes, I do believe that I can be in communion and in communication with those in paradise, because I don't believe that there is a veil between heaven and earth. I think that veil was torn 2,000 years ago by Christ. And this idea of hearing the voice of God, I mean, throughout my life, I've seen miracles. And even in the culture that I come from, this idea of the supernatural, of, experiencing angels and demons and all that, and experiencing miracles and healing, it's not outside of our theology. It's very much integrated into even the way we live everyday life. And so for me, this idea of hearing the voice of God is not this terrifying, weird thing. It's no, I mean, yeah, God's real. The supernatural is real. Why do we kind of put up red flags when someone says something like this? Now, of course, you got to be careful about, discerning what exactly is the message, and is this message from God? But when I heard this voice, I remember feeling a sense of peace and reassurance, feeling a sense of strength in my faith, and the conviction that I am willing to lose all things for Christ. I'm willing to lose all things for Christ who completes me. That was the mantra of my conversion. So anyway, as time went on, I began discerning, spiritual fatherhood, because I had this strong desire to, even from, my childhood and seeing my father be a Baptist minister, I had this desire to be a minister, to serve God's people, to serve God's church, to be doing what I can in the most intimate moments of worship, right? How can I kind of be, playing a part in maybe preaching, or, even in at least when I was Baptist, there was the pastor doing communion, but what can I do to be Christ to somebody else? And what can I do to totally surrender and give my life over to him? Because I hated this idea of living half of my life as a Christian and half of my life is in the world doing a 9-to-5 job. I want a life that is totally consecrated and given over to God. And so as time went on and I started, discerning more deeply this idea of spiritual fatherhood, this idea that, look, fathers can come in the form of obviously biological fatherhood, but also spiritual fatherhood, that a celibate man is not any less a man than one who's married or one who's had sexual relations. And so as I began discerning that, and I began thinking about the life of St. Thomas Aquinas, somebody who wanted to join the order when he was 19, and I wanted to join the Catholic Church when I was 19. and seeing the way his parents reacted and seeing the way that my parents reacted, I realized that I had this deep resonance with St. Thomas and also with the Dominican order that he'd entered because of its intellectual life. But not only that, I mean, when you look at people like St. Thomas and St. Albert, their intellectual life was not separate from their spiritual life. They had found ways in which their own theology, their own great intellects could actually elevate the soul, right? And kind of peek into the mystery of God and into the beauty of Christ. And so seeing that kind of life lived out by them and still today by the Dominicans, that really attracted me towards them. And so I reached out to the vocations director of the Central Province. At the time, it was Father Jude. And it was actually his last day. And Father Jude was like, hey, Swan, thanks for reaching out, but let me give you the email of my successor, or let me forward your email to my successor. Then a few days later, Father Samuel Hakim, the new vocations director, reaches out to me, and we, end up organizing a phone call. And he tells me about this Dominican come and see in St. Louis. And so in this Dominican come and see, what would happen is I would be kind of seeing, not all aspects of their way of life, but, enjoying Mass with them, seeing the House of Studies, the Aquinas Institute, and seeing also a little bit of SLU, St. Louis University. But I would get to know the brothers, and I'd get to sit down and really think about the future with them. And I ended up having a great time at the Come and See. And it was funny because I had a fan actually of my channel who was there, and he recognized me on the spot. And I was like, whoa, this is pretty awesome. Alex Erickson, I'll give a shout out to him. So, that first Come and See was so good because I felt like this is right for me. I want to discern with them. And so I got into contact with Father Samuel again, or actually, I think he reached out to me because he wants to keep in contact, with any of the young men who are thinking about the order, and he wants to know after the Come and See, hey, do you still want to discern with us? So, I say, hey, Father, I really enjoyed my visit here at the Come and See in St. Louis, and I think I want to go further. And so what happens is, in the discernment process or the application process, at least in the Central Province, they want you to visit 3 of their houses, 3 of, the places where they are living together in community. And so I already accomplished one of those requirements with the Come and See with the St. Dominic's Priory in St. Louis. The next place I went to was St. Pius V in Chicago. And Chicago is the headquarters of the Central Province. And man, it was an awesome time. I talk about it later elsewhere, but, basically I was staying in St. Pius V Rectory, and this is where the elderly Dominicans go to live. And the men there were absolutely high-class gentlemen. Not only that, I mean, they had great senses of humor. You saw the diversity of the Dominican life. Like, not all of them were in philosophy and theology. Some of them were musicians. Some of them were, more like missionary-oriented in preaching the gospel than kind of the abstract high theology. And seeing all these men, but especially, I was staying in kind of one of their study rooms, and I heard one Dominican brother reading a book on New Testament theology to his blind Dominican brother. Who are, they're now elderly. But when I saw that, it made me think more about the beauty of living in community, of the heart of the Dominicans, of religious life itself. And that first visit was just so good in St. Pius V, because I just remember, they were praying for me. I felt very loved. I felt very invited and welcomed, and they were willing to answer any and all of my questions. And it just felt like, when I was there, it felt like I had a bunch of you had a bunch of the best grandfathers ever around you. It was such a good time. So then I finally visit the Formation House in Denver, Colorado, and I published that video where I talk about my visit there. So I won't go into a lot of detail, but it was actually really good to see what the novice year is going to look like. And to be with the brothers that are there. I still remember, all of them, Brother Ephraim, Brother Benjamin, Brother Thomas, Brother John. I had such a good time knowing them. And as time passed, I finally said, hey, Father Samuel, I think I'm ready for the application. I've done my 3 visits. And so Father Samuel's like, great. So he gives me the application, and he kind of tells me the ins and outs of what's going on. And so I'll explain kind of what the application's like. So the application obviously has multiple components, but they'll send it to you as probably like just a complete Word doc, right? And you got to include all the basic information. So, things like financial information, your address. There are questions about, related to canon law that are there. Like, have you done this? Have you done that? And on all the rest that are there. And if you apply to a religious order, you'll see the thoroughness of the questions that are asked. And the other parts of it included letters of recommendation. It included writing an 11-page autobiography. I think it was 11 to 12 pages. And then also filling out psychological evaluations. And so what I decided to do was actually I'll get the psychological evaluations out of the way first. And, let's see here. It involved like an interview component. It involved, I think, two like questionnaires, right? Which in total were like 700 questions. So it was pretty intense. And then also you had to like do other things like draw, fill out other forms. And so let me just say right now that the Catholic Church is so thorough about making sure that the men that they bring into potentially religious life and into the clergy, that they are not going to harm the church. They are so thorough with that. And so what ended up happening in the course of my psychological evaluation is they ended up detecting that I had, I think, severe anxiety and depression. And I remember when I first heard that, and Father Samuel basically said, like, hey, Swan, I think we're going to delay when you appear before the council for your final set of interviews. So I was supposed to know by April, but they moved it to the end of May. And during that time, Father Samuel and, the order, they paid for my counseling. They paid to kind of help me get back on track, because Father Samuel, he always says, like, I want to make sure that if I'm bringing a guy before the admissions council, for the interviews, and then eventually that council the next day will tell you if you're in or not. He said, I want to make sure that this guy is ready and that I believe, that he has my endorsement. And so, the Dominicans, they covered my counseling, and through the course of my counseling, I began realizing that I still carried a lot of pain and trauma from my conversion, and especially from the realization that, from going from Protestant to Catholic, I'm now an outsider, right, to the tradition that I've been raised in, and especially among, just Protestant Christians in America. And, I remember when I was in middle school, and, I experienced bullying. It was the church, the Baptist church, and really Protestants in general, that I ran to experience a sense of home and community. And, it was a source of healing. And when I became Catholic, all of a sudden, and I went through multiple experiences that I don't think I publicly talked about, at least in total. I mean, those are private, but I do talk about some of them on Pints with Aquinas, like the things that were said to me, and the things that were done. It was strange now, for in my head, I used to view like the church as this like beacon of pure hope, and the bullies and the evil in the world as a separate thing. And then all of a sudden, the church and the bullies became the same thing. And it was such a dramatic change in my life that I don't think I was ready for or could have possibly prepared for. And, I still view, Protestants as part of the church, although in a different way now. But to see some of the things that happened and the way that I was treated, the way that my family was treated, it was really, really painful, and almost it did a significant number on me mentally. And I think what happened was I was kind of like working so hard with, doing my apologetics work, doing, all the stuff on intellectual conservatism. And I told Catholic Answers, like, hey, I think I'm just going to quit now because, when I was affiliate apologist, because I'm just experiencing a lot of pain. I'm overwhelmed. And eventually going to counseling, my counselor was actually, so I was looking for a Catholic counselor, and I actually found a really good Protestant one. And that experience of having a Protestant counselor who was not going to judge me, who was trying to understand my story and where I was coming from. I mean, he was actually ex-Catholic. That experience really improved and changed my life. And so I was finally ready to kind of go on with the application process, and I suppose that I filled out everything else right. But when it finally came to be May, I was super scared, right? Because I realize now that it's not really simply guaranteed that I'm getting in. People have told me like, Swan, you're made for the Dominican order. There's no way they're going to reject you, right? Even on YouTube, I'll see these comments. And I'm like, no, I don't know anymore because, with what happened with my mental health, things are kind of more up in the air than I had realized, and so I should not go in with the spirit of presumption. And, I was so scared. Or at least I was very nervous. I shouldn't say scared because that sounds kind of bad, but I was very nervous. And I remember when I was on the airplane, going from to St. Louis and then eventually to Chicago, because Chicago is the place where I would do my last set of interviews and then hear the results the next day. A connecting flight in Chicago. While I was on the plane flight from Kansas to Illinois, or excuse me, to Missouri, I was seated next to a very kind Protestant woman. And I explained to her she started talking to me and I started talking to her. And eventually I told her like why I was on this plane flight and where I was going. And I remember her reaction was just the sweetest reaction because she wanted to learn more. And, she wanted to try her best not to annoy me with questions. And she was very sensitive to not, kind of be ignorant, if I can put it that way. And at the very end, she prayed for me as the flight came to an end. And she said, oh, like now I'm going to be thinking about you this whole weekend. And she said, I hope that they, accept you. And I mean, her prayer did so much to heal me. And as I was in the airport in St. Louis, I remember I ran into Jason Everett. And so, Jason Everett, he's kind of coming down through the terminal. And I'm like, hey, are you Jason Everett? And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, hey, so, I'm right now, going to hear back from the Dominicans if I've been accepted. And I asked him if he remembered when he spoke to my my church community in Manhattan, Kansas. And he said, and he just had a smile on his face. And I was like, oh, I realized, like, yeah, he's probably speaking all over the place, right? He doesn't remember that he was there at speaking at one of the churches in town a year ago, right? That's such a minor detail. But I remember he said that he'd be praying for me. And it was very healing. It was very nice to run into him, and I felt my spirit kind of rise up. So anyway, I finally go from St. Louis into Chicago, and that evening I do the first few sets of interviews. And during those interviews, I've been watching the Amber Heard Johnny Depp trial, and so I think that put the wrong image in my head of like how the questioning was going to be. But as time, as the questions continued, I realized that, the priests who were interviewing me and one of the religious brothers who was interviewing me, they weren't trying to get me. It wasn't like, oh, we're trying to debunk and, find out if you're really good enough for us. It was actually very supportive. Like they actually really want to see you succeed. It wasn't like a college, admissions interview or something like that, where it's kind of like, kind of maybe more critical. This was very fraternal, very brotherly, very welcoming. And so as time went on, they asked me questions like, I don't know, let me think about this. What's your prayer life like? What is your love of God any different from that of Jesus Christ? They were asking like these very nuanced questions to try to probe, your mind on, or my mind on just my theology, my way of life. And they also wanted to ask questions like, have you ever had a girlfriend, right? My answer is no. But they wanted to know like, hey, are you able to actually talk to women? Are you actually able to recognize the goodness of marriage, right? Is this something that you desire naturally, right? And all these other things, right? And so it was very interesting to see how the questions weren't critical or trying to, gotcha, right? So the next day, I wake up, the evening, there's evening mass, and then I wake up, morning mass, morning prayers. And I do, after mass, some more interviews. And then we go to lunch. And then Father Samuel tells me, hey, Swan, it's going to take maybe an hour for us to deliberate. So, just go relax somewhere. And so I go up to the top of St. Pius V Rectory, And I go up to the rooftop in the very top portion of it, and I just sit down, and I think I had a book that I was reading, and I was also listening to music, and I'm kind of like, this is it, like, let's see how this goes. And, I was praying and just thinking about all the reasons why I want to be Dominican, but also preparing in case that I needed a backup plan, right? And Father Samuel, about 40 minutes later, calls me and he says, "Hey, Swan, come down. We're ready." So I come down and I go into the same interview room and I see all the Dominicans, who had interviewed me. And, it's kind of funny because it's like all these men in white, it felt very, very holy and solemn. And so I sit down and I'm kind of nervous. And, Father Dave, who's going to be my novice master, he's going to be like the priest who watches over the younger, newer Dominicans while we're in Denver. So Father Dave told me, "Swan, calm down. Don't worry. It's going to be okay." Like he was trying to calm me down. And so I looked over to Father Jimmy, who is kind of the head of St. Pius V Rectory and the head of the house. And Father Jimmy was like, "Swan, we all had favorable opinions about you. We all had favorable things to say." And I was like, "Oh, but I need to hear the words that I got into the novitiate," right? And then he finally says it, and they start clapping, and I'm just happy. I couldn't. Well, I think maybe like I was just so relieved that I couldn't cry, but I was like laughing. I was so happy, and then eventually, Father Dave comes up to me with a measuring tape to measure me for my habit. And then I do I do a picture in front of this image of St. Thomas talking to Christ on the cross. And, it's truly wonderful. And then that very same evening, Father Jimmy, Father Dave, and Father Samuel and we go out and have dinner at a nice Italian restaurant. And it was such a wonderful evening. It was such a wonderful day. And so that's kind of my story. And I guess I'll close with these last few minutes just talking about some advice. I think the first thing I'll say is, obviously don't pursue the religious life just because, as the church teaches, it is the highest way to live, right? Don't go in with that desire, right? Because like marriage is also beautiful. I think the fathers compare marriage to silver, celibacy to gold, right? But don't, think about it that way, right? The other thing I'd say is like, don't think that you need to be a spiritual master to come in. Like if you have some things that you struggle with, maybe you're impatient. Maybe you struggle with, maybe having kind of an anger, a temper, right? All these other things. Or maybe you wish you prayed more, right? That's okay. Make sure that these are things that can actually be fixed and worked on, that you're willing to fix and work on them, and that you're willing to listen if the Dominicans say, or a religious order says, like, "Hey, we should delay by a year, just give you some time to get these things sorted," right? But the thing is, a religious order is not expecting you to come in as a perfect Catholic. They're not expecting you to have everything totally put together, or at least they shouldn't, that what they want to see are people who are willing to grow and who have the capacity to grow in holiness and, in human development. Another thing I will say is that, as you're discerning with the Dominicans or with the religious order, make sure that you are, trying to pray, that you aren't, being presumptuous about, "Oh yeah, I'm definitely getting in." Oh, and also I'd say too, discern the vows, right? Poverty, chastity, and obedience. So make sure that, you're not just thinking about like, "Oh, well, the Dominicans are like big brained, right? And I want to go to the place where all the, the big brains are." It's like, no, that's not, they don't want more kind of just theologians for the sake of doing theology. They want an entire person, right? And so what they also want to see are men who are discerning the vows, who are thinking about religious life and actually discerning actively, is this what I'm called to? Could I live this way of life out? So, and I got that advice from, Father Brian Milady from the Western Province, also a great Dominican priest. And then I reached out to Father James Dominic Rooney of the Central Province, and I've had him on my show. And he talked about how religious life is a marriage to God. And that's the way in which you can discern the vows. I mean, because think about it like this, right? If you get married, you do make a vow of obedience because you have to pledge to your wife, right, that you will listen to her, that you will consider her, that it's not just about you, it's about her and about eventually the community that you form in the great office of the family. And then there's also this idea of, obviously chastity, right? In chastity, a marriage chastity in marriage, in natural marriage, right, calls for, or I should say in sacramental marriage, right, it calls for you to be totally devoted, your body, your faculties, right, to your spouse. Well, if you're married to God, then you have to give your body totally to God and to no one else. And so that's a way in which one is celibate, right? That's a good way to view the vow of chastity. And then poverty, right? If you're married, you have to share all your possessions basically with your wife or with your spouse. You can't really just claim that, oh yeah, this is mine and totally mine. You can't touch it. You can't do anything with it. It's like, no, you're now living in a small community, the most fundamental community, the family. In a similar way, there's this poverty in which I'm sharing all things with the church, all things with my brothers, and in that way sharing them with God, right? Giving myself totally to Him. Now, of course, some people might object to this idea of describing religious life as a marriage to God, because obviously I'm a guy and God, is referred to as Father. But I think when we view it in terms of marriage not being, at least the way that I'm using it, right? If we understand marriage as a comprehensive union, in terms of natural marriage, right, a comprehensive union occurs between one man and one woman. But in terms of a marriage between God and a creature, there is that comprehensive union that can occur through the soul, through the body and the soul of the person totally being consecrated and sacrificed over to God as a living sacrifice, as St. Paul puts it. And so in that way, then, I think if we understand marriage as a comprehensive union, it is permissible then to, even though a guy, as a guy, can talk about being married to God in an appropriate way. Marriage is not just this thing about sex, right? Marriage is largely about this idea of being totally united together for the creation of a new life or even a new reality. And so that's why I don't mind calling religious life a marriage to God. But anyway, that's kind of me just rambling on with my own theology and own thoughts. But, I hope that, sharing this will, kind of help you discern if you're discerning, or also just to understand that, the Dominicans and even just the Catholic Church in general, it's a really beautiful thing. And, I've been Catholic for 2 years now, and there's not a single day that I've regretted it. And in fact, as every day passes, I fall deeper and deeper in love with Christ and His church.